Hi everyone, good morning, buenos dias, egunon. So today I would like to talk to you a little bit about the approaches that we use when we teach minority languages, indigenous languages, less commonly taught languages, and what that means for the teaching tools that we use as well. So when I say minority language learning here, I really mean minority languages, indigenous languages, and oftentimes less commonly taught languages. That doesn't fit well, all of that on the title slide though. So minority languages on the title slide. Okay. So as instructors, I think most of us will be familiar with the idea of approaches. And as language learners, if any of you out there have studied a second language, you might be familiar with this idea as well. And there's some approaches there are many approaches, but some are more popular than others, more famous. You might have heard of the grammar translation approach, or the audio-lingual approach, or the communicative approach. And I'll give you just a really quick background of what those are. The grammar translation approach is really probably the most traditional method of teaching a language, and this is based around the idea of presenting the learner with a sample of the language of the target language, and having them translate that back to their native language, or vice versa, and giving them a sentence, say, in their native language, and having them translate it to the target language. There's the audio-lingual method, which was really popular in kind of the middle decades of the 20th century. And this is really the idea of really based around parroting. You listen to what the target language should sound like, and then you repeat it. So I think this is very popular in a lot of these approaches that use CDs or tapes. And then there's the communicative approach, which is popularized in the 70s and 80s and still very popular today, which is really based on the idea of presenting students with situations in which they're really encouraged to talk, produce as much language as possible, and comprehend as much language as possible. Maybe with the trade-off of not focusing so much on the nuance of language, with production maybe not being perfect, not aiming for perfection, and with understanding, maybe not going for all of the little cultural nuance. So 3 points I'd really like to make in this presentation are: one, that these approaches aren't absolute. So a lot of times it's easy to think of maybe the communicative approach being better than the grammar translation approach, and that certain approaches have been replaced with others. I hear this a lot from in the language instruction world when I was teaching, and also I thought this myself, but really the appropriateness of an approach depends a lot on what your learner's goals are, so it's very relative. Second point is that if you're teaching a minority language, or an indigenous language, or oftentimes a less commonly taught language, that your learner's goals might be different, and therefore the approach that you should be using as an instructor may also be different. Maybe, it depends. It really depends on your unique situation. You're the one who knows your class best. And then the third point is that if you are one of these instructors and your students have maybe goals that are more related to understanding the culture that's associated with the language, or maybe forming social connections with people who speak that language, maybe if that's more important, say, than fluency, then the internet is really an important tool. It's a very valuable resource for you. So I'd just like to briefly talk a little bit more about those points. Okay, so when choosing an approach, I think it's very important to keep in mind the goals of our students. And I think maybe it's easy to say, oh, well, if I'm a Spanish teacher, or if I'm an English teacher, when I was an English teacher, this was the case. I thought, oh, well, my student's goal is to learn English, period. And I think if that's where the thinking stops. It's useful to think about language from a perspective of sociocultural theory. And sociocultural theory was pioneered by a Russian psychologist, Vygotsky. And he really talked about language as being a tool. And I think this is a really an important way for us to think of language as educators, because usually when you have a tool, you don't just get the tool to have the tool. Oh, I have the tool. You use the tool for something else. And that's very important to keep in mind, because as when we have our students, language learners, oftentimes want to use the language for something else. And Vygotsky also talked about how language was a very versatile tool. You can do a lot of things with it. And that's also the case for language learners. Language learners potentially want to use this language for lots of different functions. Maybe it's more useful to think of it as needing they want lots of different language tools. Some people might want a language tool for, well, here. I have a whole list of things that certainly not exhaustive, but these are potential reasons why a language learner might want to learn a language. So the first one I thought of was maybe getting by. This is the idea of you're in a foreign country, you need to get on a train, you need to buy a train ticket, and you need to use the foreign language to get it. And the metric of success here is when the train leaves, are you on it or are you not? Getting by, so there's really not a lot of nuance here. There can be a lot of misunderstanding, you can mess up a lot, but it's this idea of just getting by. Is your communication good enough? So this is an attractive tool. This is desirable for a lot of language learners, especially people who think about maybe traveling. Another thing, fun. Some people think it's just fun to learn a language. Sure. Curiosity. Some students might be very interested in the actual structure of the language and how it works, the logic of it, the grammar. Translation. Maybe your students are in a position where they need to translate text from the target language into their native language. One maybe we joke a lot about as instructors is needing language to pass a test, to pass a language test. And I think we joke about it, but this is really, if we think of language as a tool, it really, if you are in a Spanish class, and you need to be in the Spanish class, there's a test at the end of the quarter. Do you have the language that helps you pass the test? So learning a language then, it's a tool for passing a test too. And then finally, a lot of students want the language in order to better understand the culture of the speakers who use the language, or maybe to understand the relationship between the language and the culture, other aspects of the culture. And then the last one I thought of was using the language as a tool for social integration. Maybe people want a language so that they can form relationships with people who speak that language, or with a society that speaks that language. So there's a lot of reasons why a language learner might want a tool, the language tool, and maybe more than just one. So now I'd like to look at how these common approaches, like the communicative approach and the grammar translation approach that I mentioned earlier, fit in with these goals. What goals are reflected by these approaches? So with the communicative approach, which I mentioned, was this idea of, it's really focused on enabling learners to be as fluent as possible, as quickly as possible, producing lots of language, understanding lots of language, well, maybe not understanding, but not fully understanding, but understanding the gist of a lot of language. I think this approach really reflects goals of that getting by, getting on the train, buying that cup of coffee. Communicative approach could be generally useful for that. If you're interested in learning language for fun, and you want to be able to say that you speak Spanish, or that you speak Basque, or what have you, the level of fluency that you gain, the level of comfort just from having produced a lot of language, can make the communicative approach attractive. With the grammar translation approach, this one that I think sometimes is thought of as being outdated or being replaced maybe by the communicative approach, this is still relevant if your goals are more translation oriented, or if you're really interested in the way the language works grammatically. If you're learning Latin, maybe this could be a very viable approach. Maybe the communicative approach for Latin isn't, maybe that's not terribly realistic for courses. Okay. Again, the approach depends on the learner goals, and I put up these pictures here of these commercial approaches, commercial products that use certain approaches to really focus on this idea that when you choose an approach, it's a strategy. It's not guaranteed. It depends on your learners, your students, and they're all different. They're all different people, they all have different goals, and within a class, you may have lots of people with different goals. So when we see products like this that say, you know, oh, this is the scientifically proven method, this is how a language is learned, not to say that these aren't useful, but it really is a strategic choice, and it's operating over a lot of uncertainty, because we really don't know what our learners' goals. I mean, 99% of the time, we don't really know our learners before they come into the class, and sometimes even the students don't even fully understand their goals. So I thought maybe we'd look at an example of a less commonly taught language, or minority language, or indigenous language, depending on where you are. Learning Basque in the US. And in case you didn't know, there actually are people who learn Basque in the US. There's a large Basque diaspora in the western United States. Well, in the Americas in general, but especially in the western United States, in Idaho, Nevada, California, due to an immigration of Basques to North America 100, 150 years ago. And Basques have been very good, the Basque immigrants have been very good about maintaining their culture, and there's a pride, especially that centers on the language. And because of this, throughout the western United States, there are a series of Basque centers called Euskal-Etxeas, and a lot of them actually offer Basque classes to the community. So here we have this situation of where we have people close to where we are right now learning a is it a minority language? Is it an indigenous language? I think it depends also on the situation, on the situation of the learner. It depends on the situation of that town, of that community. But I think we understand how it's different than people learning Spanish 1 here at UCSB. There's a difference in terms of goals. There's a difference in terms of why students end up in that classroom. So I think as an instructor, if you're teaching Basque in the United States, I think it's important to ask, well, what might my learners' goals be? You're not going to know 100%, but should you be targeting fluency? Maybe should you be targeting helping these students understand how language and culture interact? Should you be targeting them building social ties? And these are important. I think these are important questions to ask, and I don't think there is an absolute answer. But I think it's important to ask, and I think it's important to hedge your bets. Okay. So what's the most reasonable approach for these learners? Well, fluency, I don't know. If there's only 2 Basque levels, is fluency really the way to go? Might not be realistic. And also, culture, social integration, it may be that these students are learning the language in order to connect with their family, to to find a place in Basque society. It's important to think about that. So I think the internet is a really great tool if your learners have these social or cultural goals, maybe more so than fluency goals. Because with the internet, you can present your students with texts that are authentic. So they're not produced for language learners. They're produced by native speakers for native speakers. They're contemporary. New things are popping up on the internet every day, and they're contextually rich. There's a lot of multimedia material where you can see what's going on in the background. You can hear things. There's a lot of information, and there's also an intertextual context there, in that certain texts link to other texts, or have been linked from other texts. There's a digital context. Also the internet, if your students have social goals, goals of social integration. There's, of course, social networks, and there's studies of instructors using social networks in their courses. It's tricky. There's always challenges, but it's a useful tool. Telecollaboration, which is this idea of having two groups of people on different sides of the world, and they can talk about their own cultures and their perceptions of other cultures and share that. And it's kind of a language through culture approach. So culture first, and then tandem exchanges with people practicing language with one another. So the idea here, though, is if your learners are really interested in using the language for social purposes, to really integrate themselves into a society, maybe you can give them that during the course, not wait till, oh, here's the language so you can integrate yourself later. You can make that part of the course. And then finally, if your learners aren't so interested in fluency, the internet allows a lot of opportunity for collaborative production of language, which can be a really useful tool. Students can use Google Docs to create language together, and then they can post it, say, on blogs or forums, wikis, and by posting, they're actually becoming part of a digital community of native speakers. So, in conclusion, I just kind of wanted to reiterate this idea of language teaching happening on top of a lot of uncertainty. There's so much we don't know about our learners, about what they want, about what approaches will work for them. And given that flexibility is really, really important when you have so much uncertainty. And the internet really does provide you potentially with a lot of flexibility if you're willing to be creative. And so I would encourage instructors, all instructors, but especially with minority languages, indigenous languages, less commonly taught languages, where your learners might be in the classroom for different reasons, to really consider that. 'Cause it's really dynamic, and it offers learners an opportunity to connect with real samples of the language and with real people, real native speakers of the language. And I think at the end of the day, for a lot of our students, that's actually maybe what they want. And fluency might just be a secondary goal. So thank you very much, and I'd be willing to take any questions you have.